woodworker. And Stephen was a dean at Emory College. He went to DePauw and Indiana University, and has a PhD. I know this from, what is it, Rhodes University in Grahamstown, South Africa. Yes. He married his wife Nancy in 1973, and they have 3 children. An interesting thing is I was in the car, and I was going to try out for a choir. His wife got in the back seat of my car, and we didn't know each other. She was just going to try out for the choir too. Get talking. He taught up at Michigan Tech, and his wife is a teacher also, and she taught with my aunt who taught up there. And it was just like, small world. So in 2016 you moved to Grand Haven.
Right.
So you could be close to grandchildren.
Right.
And during the years that you were teaching, you were always doing woodworking. That's probably a way to, kind of just think about things and give yourself a hobby to do to burn off some steam with dealing with the students.
Clear your head.
Yes. I saw this quote, and I thought it was really interesting. One of his peers said that about his time teaching and with his students, he said he compared his leadership at the school to his wood craftsmanship, and he said, though it may be dramatic, even messy, in the first stages, slowly and methodically the bowl emerges, and adjustments are made. He never loses sight of the vision of what the bowl should be. Now the peer was talking about students, but you could see how it also correlates with woodworking. That was kind of interesting.
Where did you find that?
The Google, you can find all kinds of things. So what I always do with these artist talks, I always ask some questions and we kind of have a conversation, and then when we get done talking, you guys can ask questions too. So looking back, did you always get full support from your family and friends with regard to your woodworking?
Oh, I think I did. Woodworking was never my full-time occupation.
Right.
So their allowances weren't in jeopardy. And I started out mostly making furniture.
Oh,
And so somebody wanted a bookcase, somebody wanted a dresser, somebody wanted an armoire, and I started making those kinds of practical pieces before I got into making bowls and things like that.
Okay, and Stephen actually helped me out. I have this really wonderful cherry table that it has a lot of leaves, so it can be really huge, and it started bowing. And he came over and he's like, I can fix that. And so he put another leg in it, and now it's all nice and flat again. So if you were to start over, would you have chosen a different path? Like, would you still have been a professor, or did you want to be a full-time woodworker?
No, I never really wanted to be a full-time woodworker. I have friends who are, and it's really tough to make a living doing that, as it is any artist.
Right.
And not only is the compensation pretty limited, but you've got to please a clientele that may have very specific ideas about what they want, which may be antithetical to your aesthetic priorities. So in many ways it's been a luxury to not have to depend on selling my work.
Right. It is a luxury.
Yeah, right.
So you get to make what you want versus what somebody else wants.
Right. And even family members, they said, I really want a mid-century console.
Yeah.
Well, we could negotiate over exactly what this thing was going to look like. So.
Right, right. So tell us how you select wood, and then how you decide on the form. So here's one of Stephen's bowls.
Okay, sure. Well, I look for opportunities for wood. So I don't go to lumber yards to buy wood.
Okay.
I don't think I've ever bought a piece of wood in my life, but when there's a big storm, I put my chainsaw in the trunk and drive around, and I'm going to find someone who's got a big tree in their front yard that's fallen over. Actually, to confess, I had a really sweet arrangement when I was in Georgia, because since I was the president of this campus, I had a front end loader and a big heavy truck at my disposal, And I could just say to the grounds guys, you know, there's this tree that blew over on campus, would you send that down to Shadydale to the sawmill? And then, you know, I'd get 300 board feet of lumber back.
Advantages of being a prop.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so the sawmill actually only charged 33 cents a board foot to saw this wood, and it was worth $5 a board foot when I got it back.
Oh,
So
wow.
that was a good arrangement. But typically what I do around here is that when there's a storm or trees blow down, or there's a development going in and trees are being cleared, I just drive by and talk to whoever's doing the work and saying, you know, would you mind if I take 6 feet of that cherry tree trunk? And they say, nah, fine. So
Okay, so
that's
like,
to get it.
when I look at this bowl, for me what is interesting is it looks like there's like 4 circles or 4 quadrants in the bowl. So like, how, did you know this when you created this, that was going to happen?
Yeah, you can expect that. Now this is a piece of red oak, it's from around here.
Okay,
And if you turn it to the right point, you can see these concentric rings here.
okay,
So the center of the tree is through here,
okay,
and this is half of one side that was then made into a bowl. And if it is a straight trunk and growing very evenly, then you'll get an even grain pattern like that.
oh,
So, you know, if it's bending or has like a growth like a burl on the side or something, you'll get crazy grain patterns,
okay,
which can also be interesting.
right,
But if it's a very straight grain tree, then you're going to get that pattern,
okay.
guaranteed.
Okay, so one thing I like about wood turn bowls is that for me as a potter, I can look at forms and I can look at proportions and I can look like how does the bowl start and how does it finish? Like what is the foot on it and how does the top end? And Stephen, a lot of times I can see that in his bowls. Like for instance, for me, this bowl very specifically has that. It has a foot. And he's caused that, and it has a nice rim. And so you must think about that. You must have looked at some ceramic forms or what makes a good bowl, and think about that when you're creating it.
Yeah, I certainly do. So when I make bowls, I really have 2 goals. One is to make something useful, and the other is to make something that has some aesthetic value.
Right.
And there are a few basic rules that you can start with, okay? So every bowl should have a shadow at its base. Okay? Otherwise, it looks like it's just growing out of the table.
Right, right. You have to lift it up.
Another is that it should never end in a vertical plane, because that is, quote, unresolved. Okay?
Right.
So either it should be outflowing or inflowing. Another rule is that the base should be approximately 1/3 of the diameter. Not less because it becomes unstable.
Right.
Maybe more if it's a heavy form that looks like it needs the support. But after those 3 rules, you're kind of on your own.
Right.
Okay. So you just have to study it, and you and I talked about this before, but there are bowl forms, whether they're ceramic or wood or hammered metal, that the form just flows so well that when you look at it, you think, yes,
Right.
that's the right form. Does anybody here speak French?
Swedish.
Swedish? Okay, well, my friends who speak French tell me that when you go to a dinner at someone's house in France and you want to compliment them on the dinner, you don't say that was good, you say it was correct. Okay? And there's that same sense of correctness when you get the bowl form right.
And I'll carry that a step further. I tell a lot of people here in the gallery that you may not know anything about art, but your gut will tell you if something was made correctly. And you can say that with regard to a painting, you can say that with glass, you can say that with pottery. You might not have the vocabulary, but you intuitively know what works percentage-wise and things.
Not every piece is a success.
Correct.
Okay? Some I set aside and put screws and bolts in, that sort of thing. But you can continue to work a form I don't think you can do this so much in potting, but if you've got a bowl in the lathe and it doesn't look right, you can keep working it.
Okay.
You can't put wood back, but you can take more off.
Get
And
a
a lot of
smaller
times,
bowl.
yeah, right, get a smaller bowl. And I always start in the final step that determines the shape. The first thing I do is flatten the front because it's rotating this way. Okay. So I flatten the front and then I shape the outside because you can always shape the inside relative to the outside.
Right.
But it's the outside usually that gives you the form. Now, you asked me if I had any sort of wow pieces to bring along.
Right.
Okay. So this is one of my wow pieces because when I was done with it, I just thought, yes.
And I agree with you. I love
That's
that
what I
bowl.
do.
Yeah.
So the inside has a sort of very comforting.
It has a really
curve
nice slope.
to it, but the outside is just as good, I think.
Yep, it is.
And it feels good in the hand.
Yep.
It has good balance. The foot is large enough you can grip it. So this has been tested with potato chips and succeeded. It has that sort of utility. So this is one of those, and this is local cherry.
Okay. And so, for instance, when I start making a bowl, I know ahead of time what form I'm going to make. When you're making, do you know that? Like, do you know the slope? Do you know, like, for instance, I'll take a different thing for you.
Sure.
So, for instance, this piece, I can answer this question, I'm still going to ask it.
Okay.
So when you start with this, have you already decided what the slope is going to be and how you're going to make it? Or like, do you determine right away that this is going to be a straight-sided?
Only partly. Okay, so when, to give a good answer to that question, I need to step back a little bit and talk about the process for making these. So all of my projects start with a chainsaw.
Okay.
And so I have a log, and then I cut off a length of the log that is a little bit longer than the diameter of the log. Okay. And then I take that short piece and I split it down the middle with the chainsaw. Okay. And that gives me 2 half cylinders. Okay. Then I take the half cylinder and lay it flat side down on my bandsaw and cut it into a disc.
Okay.
Then when I've got the disc, I put it on my lathe and shape it to this form that you're seeing now.
Okay.
And first I put this, there's a screw chuck that screws into the solid wood of the disc and turns it so I shape the outside. And when I shape the outside, I leave this nub on the back, which can then be grasped by a chuck. And I turn it then this way and hollow out the inside.
Oh.
Now, this, and doing that is what people call making blanks.
Okay.
So this is a blank.
Okay.
This doesn't look like a bowl. Well, it looks like one, but it's not anything like one because it's so thick. So when this dries, it changes shape.
Oh.
You can see that it's not round, it's an oval. Okay. You can also see that if you look at this way, it's not flat either. Okay. Because the center wood is denser than the wood around it.
Okay.
And so it shrinks
At a different pace.
at a different pace, right, just like that. So this, when I remember I put the date on, I made this blank on August 11th, 2017. Okay. So a little more than a year ago.
Okay.
And it takes at least a year for it to reach equilibrium with your indoor air humidity.
Okay.
So it's going to start out at about 80% water, and it will stabilize at about 12%.
Okay.
Actually, when I'm turning the blanks, I sometimes get wet
Oh.
because it's turning fast enough that it's throwing water out of the wood.
Oh, wow. Okay. So when you start a form and then you let it sit for a year and a half or so, and then you come back to it and then finish it.
Right. Now, so you're asking about shape.
Right.
So this has got lots of possibilities. I could make an enclosed form using plenty of wood,
Yep.
or I could make an outflowing form. But it's basically going to be about this tall and about this big around.
Okay.
So there are forms that this wouldn't let me make. It's
Such
not
as?
a more enclosed form.
Okay. So curving in.
Right. And it won't let me make a real tall form.
Right, it's too late.
Yeah.
So what about this right here? What would happen with this?
Okay, that's bark
Oh, okay.
from the tree when I was turning the blank. So I turned it down just to leave that little bit of bark because that gives me the maximum possibilities for that piece of wood.
Okay.
So when I put it on the lathe and turn it down, I'll turn it past the bark.
Which means you will get rid of it.
Yes.
Okay.
It will disappear. This is what people sometimes call ambrosia maple.
Hmm.
There's a beetle called the ambrosia beetle, which infects maple trees. And when it does that, it makes streaks in the wood, which some people think is aesthetically pleasing. So these streaks are caused by the beetles.
Oh, huh.
So,
Oh, cool. All right.
but they haven't damaged it much. It's still very solid wood. And you can also see here, I'll sort of rock it back and forth so you can maybe see it a little better on this surface. It's what people would call fiddleback or tiger maple. It has that ripply pattern in it.
Mm-hmm.
So I know having, from that same log, I've finished some other bowls, and it turns out to be beautiful. It really, reflects the light really well.
Oh, cool.
So,
Okay. Do you have an all-time favorite piece that you've made?
I really don't. There are things I like about all of them, and sometimes I look at them and think, well, maybe it would have been better with a slightly smaller foot or something.
Right, well, we all have that.
Yeah. Right, so there's no number one favorite.
All right, so what do you dream of making?
Oh, gosh. So I shared your list of questions with my wife.
Yeah?
And she said, ha, what do you dream of making? I tried to convince her that when we moved to Grand Haven, we should build a super insulated, environmentally sound house,
Okay.
which we built when we lived in Haven. We built one using the technologies of the 1980s.
Oh.
But so much has happened since then that you could build a net zero electrical power use house.
Right.
She no longer has the appetite for building houses.
Okay.
She did all the wiring in the old house, and she just says she's not up to it. So
Okay.
that was my dream, not to be realized.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. So you brought a couple other things here, and I wondered what you wanted to share with us. Like, oh, I know this black piece is kind of interesting.
Okay, we haven't talked about finishes, because
Right.
finishes are important. Once the bowl is turned, you want to make it useful, and it's not useful if it doesn't have a good finish on it. So there are two finishes that I use in almost every case. One of them is an oil and wax finish, and that's a very practical finish, and it's sort of very natural. So this walnut bowl right here and the magnolia bowl, the big one, both have oil and wax finishes. It's a walnut oil that has been catalyzed so it hardens, and you coat the wood with that. It penetrates really well, and it takes about a week to get really hard, like oil paints do, for example. And then after that, I put a paste wax on it that is a mixture of beeswax and carnauba wax. And that waxy finish is water repellent, as is the oil. So, you could, this particular shape doesn't lend itself necessarily to a salad bowl, but one that was that size, of that shape, you could use it every day, wash it out with warm water and dish soap, and dry it with a towel, and it would be perfectly happy for 6 months. 6 months later, it would be ready for another coat of wax.
So what would people use, people like us, what do we use and what do we buy to take care of our wood bowls?
I can give you an address for Mahoney's bowl finish.
Okay.
It's like $13 for a jar that will last the rest of your life and probably your grandkids.
And can it be used on like wood, serving utensils and
Yes, it
things,
would be
and
good for
cutting
that, too.
boards, and so like if you have wood cutting boards in your kitchen, you could.
Right.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, people say that mineral oil is good for that, or some people use vegetable oils. Vegetable oils will spoil eventually, become rancid. Mineral oil won't. But this Mahoney's product is a better texture. It will last longer, it's got a better feel, it won't feel greasy on the board. So if you put mineral oil in your cutting board and then lay the cutting board on your towel, you're going to have oil stains on your towel. This won't do that.
Okay, can it be used on fine furniture?
There are other waxes that are harder, that are better for fine.
Okay, just curious. Okay, go ahead.
So the oil and wax is sort of my go-to finish because it's very practical. This bowl, however, has polyurethane on it. And I choose polyurethane for woods that have a lot of light in them. Because it really lets you see that. It really sort of highlights it, makes it evident. And that bowl, if I remember, has 6 coats of polyurethane on it, steel wooled in between coats, so that it is
really
fairly solid. Well, it's a fairly absorbent wood too, so to get an even coat, to get an even sheen after it was finished, multiple coats were required.
Okay, I'll pass it around.
And then it's coated with wax after that, just to give it that nice, comfortable feel.
So then what about this one?
So this is something that's, I think, is a lot of fun. This is white oak, and it's turned black by painting it with an iron solution. Okay. And iron solution is made by taking a piece of steel wool and putting it in about 3 ounces of vinegar and letting it stand overnight. Okay. So the acid in the vinegar dissolves the iron, makes an iron solution. Then you just put the iron solution on the wood, and the iron reacts with the tannins, the natural tannins in the wood, and turns them jet black.
Sweet.
So there's no stain, there's no paint, this is just the wood.
Okay, so wait, a question. So is that, will that work on any wood?
No. No, it only works in woods that have high tannin content.
Okay.
And white oak is the best.
Okay.
Okay. People have sort of gamed the arrangement by making strong tea and putting the tea on the wood, letting it dry, and come back later with the iron solution.
Okay.
But it's not using tannins that were naturally in the wood.
Okay.
So this is called ebonizing, and it was a favorite trick of the arts and crafts movement at the turn of the 20th century.
Yes.
But it's actually very much older than that. The monks in the Middle Ages would take oak galls, these little galls that form on the branches of oak trees when wasps lay their eggs on them, and the response of the oak tree to the gall is that it sees it as a foreign body, so the immune response is that they send lots of tannins to that spot. Now, tannins react with proteins. They bind up proteins and make them inactive. So that's why tannin was used to tan leather, for example. Okay. So these concentrated tannins in the oak galls, then the monks would harvest those, crush them, mix them with an iron solution described as, made as I just described, and that was the ink that they used, jet black ink, to write these illuminated manuscripts. The problem is that after a few hundred years it begins to break down, and so there then became a cottage industry of going over the lettering and repeating it with a more chemically sophisticated ink. But oak gall ink was used in the Middle Ages as the dominant ink for writing.
Interesting.
So it's just kind of a fun trick.
Are these tannins something that you have to worry about getting into the water supply and so forth? You have to be aware of how you dispose of them or anything?
That's a good question. No, they're pretty harmless in any natural concentration. There have been studies done of people who use shallow wells in areas where the groundwater is stained with tannins. So you've probably seen, like in the Upper Peninsula, there are rivers that are sort of tea brown. And there's some suggestion that drinking that as your main water supply may have some health consequences, but mostly just metabolic consequences in terms of slowing people down. So, that could just be the GP.
So, did you ever have an aha moment? Can you think of an aha level or?
The closest I might have gotten to that is that people describe bowl making as the most difficult practice in woodworking.
Mm.
Now, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but there are a lot of ways to ruin a bowl when you're making it. And the problem is that it's turning at many hundred, sometimes more than 1,000 RPMs, and there's a lot of force in that. And the tools that you use to shape it are chisels, and they have to be razor sharp so that you can control the thickness of the cut. And if you don't get the angle of the chisel just right, it will dig into the wood, tear out a big chunk, and then you start over. So there were several aha moments in terms of learning to use specific tools.
Okay, yeah.
And once you learn to use that tool, then you can go ahead and do a lot with it.
Right.
Until the next time you get it stuck. But
Right.
there's
Sharpen it again and start it. Yeah.
But that's that opens up new possibilities when you
Right.
figure out how to use that particular chisel.
So is there anything else that I haven't asked you that you can think of?
Yeah. Right.
Do you have a
Well-
favorite wood
I was gonna
that
ask
you
that
like?
question.
I really appreciate them all. Some are much easier to work with. So in terms of the structure of wood, there are really sort of two categories. There's what's called ring porous wood and wood that's not ring porous. So ring porous means that the xylem tubes are continuous all the way through the wood. And so a drop of water from capillary action will really go the full length. Those tend to be coarse grained, and they're not as easy to work with as closed grain, small grained woods, because the grain tends to tear a little bit.
So give an example of the open versus.
Okay, oak is the most common ring porous wood. It's very open grained. A good illustration of that was that I was finishing a tabletop of a big dining table I'd made for my sister, and she wanted it stained a certain color. And I was using this liquid stain in one area, and it popped up over here.
Oh.
Okay.
Hello.
The capillary action just pulled the stain right through over to another place where the grain. Those two bowls next to you, magnolia and elm, are both closed cell woods, and they're finer grained. Dogwood is a very tight grained closed cell wood.
What about
And
cherry?
Cherry is also
Okay.
good.
Maple?
Maple is good.
Okay.
Cherry is a very hard wood.
Okay.
I don't know if most people may not be aware of that, but the fine furniture makers in 18th century America, Duncan Fife and his lot, used mahogany in preference to cherry because mahogany was much softer.
Oh.
And cherry was just way too much work. Since you were
Okay.
using all hand tools in those days, it was just hard work using cherry. But cherry turns beautifully. It finishes well. You can get a high gloss finish on it if you want. So I like cherry as well. Yeah. Oh, okay. I was going to talk about another thing I enjoy is technical challenges, figuring out how to make something. And I made this for Easter for my wife years ago. Okay, but it's kind of an Easter eggy sort of thing, and I don't exactly remember how I made it. But you have to make jigs that will hold pieces.
Okay.
There's no standard off-the-shelf device that you can
Oh.
that will hold this. So you sort of there's an extra engineering step.
So all woodworkers are a bit engineered because they have to make their own jigs?
It depends, you know, for bowls like that now, the jigs that are needed are readily available.
Okay.
But nobody's going to be able to sell a jig and to make an Easter egg, okay?
Right.
'Cause
Yeah.
the volume's going to be small.
Well, you know, and like for potters, we like to make our own tools and our own stamps because that means then it's our own unique mark and things, only when we use our tools will it make that form exactly. There must be a little bit of that with woodworking because then you can at least say that that is uniquely yours.
Yeah. There are people who market their uniquely designed chisels.
Okay.
They have a different shape, different balance. They'll give you a pamphlet on how to use it, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Right. Anybody have any other questions?
A final thing I might just say in summary is that there are lots of different ways to talk about art, but one of the general ways I think about it is that good art is evocative. You know, it evokes something in you. And for me, wood is evocative because I know it well enough. I've worked with so many different kinds. And it's warm, and it's a traditional material. You probably have all heard the story about the Danish tradition, spelled H-U-G-G-E, and this pronunciation is a challenge. But the idea is it's basically a way to get through the winter by just enjoying traditional things like a nice wood stove and a nice knitted shawl and wooden bowls to put your food in. And it's just sort of the warmth that comes from them. Now, something that I thought you might enjoy is this piece I've got here.
Okay.
It's my favorite.
Yeah. So, another thing about fun wood is you can get wood from unusual places or unusual stories. This is a piece of southern yellow pine that I got from a beam that I salvaged from a building that was built in 1907. And you can see by the rings, this is from the center of the beam. So this is 19th century wood, but very likely 18th century wood. And you can tell it was from a virgin forest because the rings are so closely packed together that it was growing very, very slowly. In the south, these yellow pines, when they grow slowly, the wood is saturated with resin, and you can smell it.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So I'll just pass that around, as you can see. So you're smelling the, probably the 18th century there, is when those aromatics got weighed down. So it's fun to have wood with a story, too.
Need a glass dried up? You want a glass of wine? Something to drink?
I think that's mine. I may as well claim it. That's good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So you mentioned some of those aha moments. This is something that I've been toying with to get into and start myself. When is that peak of aha moments kind of reduced to more of seasoned knowledge versus, oops, I just broke another one?
Yeah. Oh, I guess I haven't broken one for several years.
Oh, it's fine.
So, yeah.
In the maker's world, there's a storyline that says you have to do something 10,000 times before you're really a master at it.
If you're not breaking it, you're just not really.
Right, you're not pushing it.
And you mentioned that you shelf dry your wood for a year or so. Is there any instance that you actually do a kiln dry that expedites that, or is that something that you've tried before?
I've read about people who get impatient and put their bowl projects in the microwave.
That's not going to happen here, but it will probably try my patience just
What
a little bit.
are the situations to do that though? What type of humidity and what are the?
Okay, so actually that's another one of those aha moments, because when I first started doing this, I lost a lot of them to cracks that would develop because they were drying too quickly.
Okay.
So, and I hardly ever lose one now. The thing that I do is I rough turn them, and then I put the wet blank into a box, a big cardboard box with a bunch of other wet blanks, and put it in an unheated garage in an area that doesn't get any sunlight. And that
In
just,
West Michigan?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he lives in the township here.
So like 80% humidity more or less, something like that, right?
Yeah, the more humid the better to start with.
Yeah.
Okay. So it has to stay in an unheated environment for at least 6 months. And then you can bring it in. But there's another trick as well. And I used it on this bowl, but for some reason you can't see it anymore. And that is that you can buy a compound that will seal the end grain. So if it's going to develop cracks, they're going to be like this from this central point that radiate out like that. And I painted this surface, both inside and out, with this end grain seal. And that really reduces the loss. Before I knew about the end grain sealer, I used candle wax and a hot iron. And just ironed the wax on there and it sealed it up just as well. So that's an important trick to know. In Grand Rapids, there is the Grand River Wood Turners Club, I guess, I think it's called. And a person who wanted to get started doing this kind of thing, that would be the very best resource because they're eager to help people learn how to do it. They're very generous with their time, and they've taught a lot of people to do it in the past. So they're good.
I have a friend on the West Coast. He does burls.
Yeah.
And he's been doing those, starting that up, and he's had some failures and some successes. But I'm married to a potter, so I was just wondering about the whole maybe using a specific kiln to possibly help that drying process along. But
So right now I've got probably 100 blanks, and I really needed to start making finished bowls.
right.
Because the inventory of blanks was getting pretty good. But next spring I'll start making blanks again. Actually, the right time to make blanks is now, because the leaves have dropped off the trees and a lot of the moisture's gone to the roots. So the wood is naturally drier now than it would be at any other time of the year, at least during the winter. And one of the things, I guess I haven't brought in any, but I've made a few natural edge bowls with the bark still on it.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Yeah. And you pretty much have to make that with wood that you get when the leaves are off the trees, because if you don't, as it shrinks, the bark will come off.
Right.
So.
Answer any other questions?
The wax, the Carnauba combination wax that you were speaking of, do you have the resource for that, or where would one get that?
Sure. If you, I can write it down for you, but it's just Mahoney's Bowl
Mahoney's.
Finish.
Okay, thank
So
you.
I'll
And
get
if
it
you-
from you and we'll put it on the website.
Yeah, okay, sure.
We'll put it on his portfolio page.
I
So,
think Amazon has it.
So what do you
anything
do with all
else?
your chips? Do you like burn them for fuel, or I mean that's a lot of byproduct, I'm sure, after.
It is. No, I've got a 33-gallon trash can, and sometimes I can fill it a couple of times.
Actually, you know what, that brings something to mind. When I lived in Vermont, I used to make pots that I would fire them twice in my kilns, and then I would fire them a third time in a sawdust kiln, and I had a woodworker that I would get his shavings from to use for those firings.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so it's been a long time, but maybe I should do that now that I've got some.
Yeah. Anybody who wants them, they smell really good, especially when I'm turning cedar.
Yeah, but.
You can use the cherry for smoking. And,
Yeah.
wow.
Well, Republic Service gets them now. So.
Oh, no.
gosh.
It's repurposed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else?
I have a friend who turns, and he does a lot of, like, he glues pieces together, like different colors and that sort of stuff. Have you ever done that sort of thing?
I haven't. There's a long tradition of making segmented turnings, as they're called, and a lot of them are really beautiful. But I've just never done that.
Kind of have to pick the things that you want to do.
Right. There's one other prop I brought along.
Okay.
Just sort of. Now, my own personal aesthetic is that I grew up in Indiana in a house with a lot of pioneer age antiques in it. Okay. And they were simple yet elegant in their own sort of way. And so the shaker design ethos is one that I sort of internalized, and instinctively I kind of go there. I love arts and crafts styles. I've never tried the fancy, highly carved furniture styles, but with my bowls, I think there's always ample challenge in achieving the right form. Now, there's this really good book called The Art of Turned Bowls. It's written by this Australian woodturner, Richard Graffin, who's world famous in the art community. And the first half of the book is on the kinds of things that we've talked about tonight. You know, about contours and shapes and the way that you calculate them and what looks good to your eye and what doesn't. The second half of the book is about making them highly decorated with all kinds of inlays and carvings and stuff like that. To my mind, that's a distraction. If I'm still trying to get the form right.
Well, and you have to make choices.
Yeah.
As an artist, you
Right.
have to choose what path you're going to go down. So you've chosen to not.
Yeah, yeah. So I've never taken time to carve the final product, and I'm not really interested in fancy inlays or painting them or
Just
doing that sort of thing. I'm mostly creating something that is hopefully as useful as it is decorative.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Oh my gosh, thank you.
Thanks for the chance to talk about wooden bowls.
Good job. Thank you.